Hi everybody, it's Miss Cole. Welcome back for more of Pride and Prejudice. If you are a recent subscriber or you just stumbled across this video, I would highly suggest, although it's entirely up to you, this is going to cover chapters 16 through 20 of Volume 1 of Pride and Prejudice. So if you haven't seen the other ones, you might want to start there. I don't know. Also, if you haven't read or watched Pride and Prejudice, there will be spoilers for chapters 16 through 20. If you are studying Pride and Prejudice and you just don't want to read the book, I would suggest reading the book because it'll take you less time, because I have lots to say. So, chapter 16. This is my library copy of the book. We skip ahead to the next evening when the Bennet girls plus their cousin Mr. Collins head back to their uncle's house in the family carriage. And I guess the parents weren't invited because there wasn't enough room in the dinner party? Although with them, plus the Phillipses, plus the officers, it's hard to see what a difference two more people would have made. So, I don't know why Mr. and Mrs. Bennet aren't there. Mr. Collins goes on and on about houses when he's there. The Phillipses, his own, and Lady Catherine's. Apparently the girls don't want to listen to this, and instead just sit in silence and look at the china on the mantle. I don't understand why they can't just ask Mr. Collins his opinions on another topic in which they might have more interest, and then they could have a conversation. But maybe it's, like, unmannerly? I don't know. I don't know enough about the manners of our current society, so I don't get it. I'm also curious about whether there are any Phillips children, how old they are, and what has happened to them. However, I don't think I'm going to get to find out anytime soon because Mr. Phillips shows up with the officers and Mr. Wickham, who is far beyond them all in person, countenance, air, and walk. I guess by in person, the author means that he's personable, like charming. Although how that's different from his air is kind of unclear. Anyway, Mr. Wickham sits next to Elizabeth, and they chit-chat, and she finds him easy to talk to, even though it's just little nothings about the weather and such. Then they have some pre-dinner games, apparently whist and lottery. While the fact that they're playing whist isn't particularly important, this is, I think, the first time that they've mentioned a game that I've heard of people playing. I'd assume Vente is very much like blackjack because it literally means 21 in French, but I don't think I'd heard it called that before. Anyway, this got me to thinking about the way card games and the traditions that surround them have changed over the years. Whist became popular in the 1600s, so add in from my notes. I don't actually know all this stuff. Like, I got interested in it and I looked it up. So this is stuff that I have looked up from the internet. So whist became popular in the 1600s. It was a spin-off of a well-known game called Trump, and became popular through the 18th century. Later versions developed into bridge, popular in the early 20th century, and spades, which is one of the most popular modern card games. All of these games typically involve partners playing in teams, as well as a rule set that has a rigid order of precedence that restricts the order in which you may play the cards that you're holding, as well as the relative values of the cards. So while chess carries metaphors for war and conflict and strategy and logic and level-headedness, whist, bridge, spades, and similar games are about relationships, how we understand each other, how well we work together, or don't, and about the social restrictions that influence and guide these interactions. As a result, it's interesting to reflect on who chooses which game before dinner. Mr. Collins says he doesn't know how to play whist, which I think is supposed to be an indicator of his humble upbringing. I'm not sure who else is playing whist, but we're told that Mr. Wickham comes over to the other table and sits between Elizabeth and Lydia, who get caught up in playing the game of lottery. And that allows Elizabeth the chance to talk to Mr. Wickham and perhaps find out what was behind this strange interaction of the previous day. Obviously, it would be rude to bring it up directly, but fortunately, Mr. Wickham seems to be curious about Mr. Darcy. He asks about Netherfield, which is reasonable with her being a neighbor and all of that. She mentions that she knows Mr. Darcy, and then Mr. Wickham says he knows him quite well, and asks her what she thinks of him. Elizabeth replies somewhat intensely and is quite clear about her thoughts. Mr. Wickham seems guarded in his response, and he asks her if she would be as forthright if she weren't among family. Never mind that she's speaking to someone who isn't family and she's only just met. She retorts that she would speak just as bluntly anywhere else except Netherfield, where he is staying with his friends. Again, Mr. Wickham responds somewhat neutrally, but Elizabeth is not letting this go now that she's found somebody who's willing to listen. Mr. Wickham finally begins dropping a few hints about Mr. Darcy, but doesn't give details, and propriety prevents Elizabeth from asking. Okay, Wickham stuff. So, spoiler space again. So, knowing what I know about Mr. Wickham being a bad sort, this comes across as him kind of testing the waters with Elizabeth at first and then sort of reeling her along by half telling her things. Once she's intrigued, he worms his way further into her good graces by complimenting her town, her friends, her family, and then he starts giving her more details. Okay. Spoilery bits over. I'm going to try to be restrained and non-spoilery from this point on, at least in this chapter. So, Mr. Wickham finally explains why he doesn't like Mr. Darcy. He says that Mr. Darcy's father was always very kind to him and had promised to essentially give him a job as a pastor, which is kind of a gentleman's job. But the previous Mr. Darcy died before the job opened up. And Mr. Wickham was officially an adult when it did, but the current Mr. Darcy gave the job to somebody else, saying that Mr. Wickham had problems with, quote, extravagance, imprudence, in short, anything or nothing. Again, so I'm quoting Mr. Wickham, who is talking about Mr. Darcy here. So now Mr. Wickham is joining the military instead, which he really hadn't wanted to do. Elizabeth is shocked by this and says that Mr. Darcy should be called out for such shenanigans, but Mr. Wickham says he won't do something like that because he remembers Mr. Darcy's father so fondly, which of course warms Elizabeth's heart even further. She does, however, wonder aloud why Mr. Darcy was so rotten. Mr. Wickham says he thinks it's because Mr. Darcy's father liked him so much and Mr. Darcy was jealous of someone else being given preference. This actually surprises Elizabeth, who had thought that Mr. Darcy was merely unpleasant and wouldn't have pinned him as actively malicious. But she then thinks back on their conversation at Netherfield, where he talked about holding grudges, which she refers to as his boasting. So boasting about holding grudges. The more she thinks it over, the more it kind of gets under her skin that Mr. Darcy really must be absolutely a terrible person. Mr. Wickham points out that the same pride... Oh, hey look! Reference to the title! The same pride that made Mr. Darcy treat him so badly can also make him do things that are generous and thoughtful because he wants other people to think well of him. That makes Elizabeth think of Mr. Bingley. And she wonders how Mr. Bingley can have had him as a live-in guest and not noticed how horrible he is. Mr. Wickham says that Mr. Darcy has the skill to be, quote, a conversable companion if he thinks it worth his while. And that with the rich, he is liberal-minded, just, sincere, rational, honorable, and perhaps agreeable. And of course, the narrator is encouraging you to think, perhaps not, because he hasn't been agreeable, this whole time. And additionally, Mr. Wickham is presenting his point of view here. That it implies that if he thinks it's not worth his while, that if Mr. Darcy isn't a good companion to you, it's because he thinks you're not worth his while. That's the implication that Mr. Wickham is giving to Elizabeth. So, the whist game finishes up, and Mr. Collins comes over and sits between Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips, talking about how he doesn't mind losing money in the game because Lady Catherine de Bourgh takes care of him. Mr. Wickham quietly tells Elizabeth that Lady Catherine's sister was Mr. Darcy's mother, and that people think that Miss de Bourgh and Mr. Darcy are going to marry to bring the estates together. Elizabeth seems to feel a little smug when she thinks about how Miss Bingley has been trying to get Mr. Darcy's attention. They have dinner, and it says there could be no conversation in the noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party, but I would think that noise would mean that they could have a side conversation more easily without having to worry about being overheard. Like, everyone else's conversation would sort of muffle it. But anyway, the evening ends and the narrator tells us that Elizabeth went away with her head full of him. Chapter 17. The author is definitely setting us up here. Back at home the next day, Elizabeth takes Jane outside for a walk and spills everything to her, and Jane is just gobsmacked. The narrator tells us that it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable appearance as Wickham. The thing is, I don't think it's in Jane's nature to question the veracity of anybody. Like, she could meet Dr. Terminus and he'd be twirling his mustache at her, and she'd still absolutely buy some face cream or hair tonic from him just because he seemed so genuine. Jane isn't willing to believe that either Mr. Darcy could be so awful or that Mr. Wickham could be lying. And she proposes that it's all some kind of big misunderstanding. Elizabeth teases her about it, but not too badly, as she does seem to be a bit upset at the idea, saying that it is distressing. One does not know what to think. And Elizabeth retorts, one knows exactly what to think. She says that Mr. Darcy could just contradict it, although one wonders how he would know somebody was saying something like that if it wasn't true. And Elizabeth is also certain that Mr. Wickham just looked truthful. Really? Really, Elizabeth? Oh my God. So there's a lot about appearance here. Anyway, Mr. Bingley arrives with his sisters, although apparently not Mr. Hurst. Presumably they came via carriage, though it doesn't specify, because one cannot imagine them walking 3 miles through fields of tall grass and mud! Anyhow, they are there to offer a personal invitation to the ball at Netherfield, but they talk almost exclusively to Jane. Elizabeth gets a weensy bit of attention, and everybody else gets ignored or even avoided. Mrs. Bennet. Jane is looking forward to an evening with her 2 friends, and of course, Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth is looking forward to getting to dance with Mr. Wickham and watching Mr. Darcy squirm in agony at the possibility of being found out. Mary isn't particularly excited about it, but seems to think it will be relatively pleasant to spend some time among others, as long as she can have the rest of the day alone. Mary, girl, I feel you. Elizabeth is nearly giddy thinking about the ball, and she asks Mr. Collins if he's going to go because sometimes dancing is like sinful, or at the very least not solemn and prudent. But Mr. Collins says that Mr. Bingley being, quote, a young man of character, there wouldn't be the least bit of harm not only in going, but even in joining the dances himself. And he then proceeds to ask Elizabeth for the first pair, and she's like, oh, whoopsie, because she'd wanted to dance with Mr. Wickham as much as possible, and now she's stuck being polite and accepting Mr. Collins's offer. And then, after she agrees to that, he starts paying more attention to her and complimenting her, and her mother even takes her aside and starts dropping hints that she thinks the 2 of them make a nice couple. And then it rains for a few days, and they're stuck inside the house, but they don't mind because they're all looking forward to the ball, the end of chapter 17. Chapter 18. On the day of the ball, Elizabeth dresses very carefully, hoping to win the heart of Mr. Wickham. But when they arrive at Netherfield, he is nowhere to be found. At first, Elizabeth thinks Mr. Bingley didn't invite him in order not to make Mr. Darcy uncomfortable, but Lydia asks one of the other officers, Mr. Denny, who says that he was invited, but he had to go to town on business. And then Mr. Denny kind of decides that the timing of that business was very convenient in allowing him to stay away from, quote, a certain gentleman here. Elizabeth is thus peeved at Mr. Darcy for being the reason she can't spend the evening with Mr. Wickham. And she's even a little grumpy with Mr. Bingley for being friends with Mr. Darcy and not Mr. Wickham. She unloads all of this on Charlotte Lucas, her friend, and also points out the awkward Mr. Collins and is then stuck dancing with him for the first 2 dances, which is just miserable because he doesn't know what he's doing and he's grim and apologetic and just not very enjoyable to spend time with. She ditches him as soon as she can manage, which our narrator tells us, quote, was ecstasy. I feel kind of bad for Mr. Collins. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's his fault, given what we've learned of his upbringing, that he doesn't know these, posh people type dances. So, I feel kind of bad that she's snubbing him for that. So, she next dances with one of the other officers and finds out that everybody likes Mr. Wickham, which doesn't surprise her. She returns to Charlotte, and while they're talking, Mr. Darcy comes up and asks her to dance, and she's so caught by surprise that she accepts sort of out of the habit of being polite. She's irked with herself, but Charlotte points out that Mr. Darcy, being quite wealthy and well-established, would be an excellent catch. So they dance. And at first, she decides she's not going to talk to him. But then she decides to punish him by forcing him into small talk. So she says something about the dance. And he replies and lets it drop. She lets the silence linger. And then she tells him that it is his turn to say something pointless because she took the first round. They continue making chit-chat, and eventually he asks if they often walk to Meryton, which is the town. She takes that opportunity and says, oh yes, when you saw us there the other day, we were just being introduced to a new friend. Ever so casually, of course. But also, of course, she is watching him, and she is not disappointed. He tenses up even more than he had been, and she lets it drop, though the narrator tells us that she blamed himself for her own weakness, which I find intriguing. Like, it would be rude, and kind of obviously so, to pursue it at that point. So I'm not sure how it's weakness. Unless maybe we're supposed to think she feels empathy for having made him feel uncomfortable? Maybe? Anyway, they manage another terse exchange about Mr. Wickham, and then Sir William Lucas, that's Charlotte's father, goes past them as he crosses the room and makes some sort of bland compliment about how nicely they're dancing together, and hints that he hopes that these sorts of things happen more often in the future after, quote, a certain highly desirable event. And he gives a very significant look toward Mr. Bingley and Miss Bennet, who are dancing together. And Mr. Darcy looks over at them with, quote, a very serious expression. The dance isn't quite over, so they quasi-banter back and forth and finally leave each other alone, though apparently, in Darcy's breast, there was a tolerable, powerful feeling towards her. Shortly thereafter, Miss Bingley comes over to Elizabeth in a thorough snit, going on and on about how Mr. Wickham is not the right sort of people, being that he's the son of a servant, and Mr. Darcy has always been remarkably kind to him, and that it is Mr. Wickham who has always treated Mr. Darcy in a most infamous manner, although, of course, she admits she knows none of the details. And her final barb is just so telling. Quote, I pity you, Miss Eliza, for this discovery of your favourite's guilt, but really, considering his descent, meaning that his father was not a gentleman, one could not expect much better. So, apparently, Jane, who is completely incapable of thinking anyone could ever do anything unkind, has been talking to the Bingley sisters to try to get to the bottom of what must certainly be just a big old misunderstanding. Oh, oh, oh boy. Anyway, Jane says that Mr. Bingley thinks that Mr. Darcy is in the right and that neither he nor his sisters think Mr. Wickham is, quote, a respectable young man. But then when Elizabeth asks, Jane says that Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham, and Elizabeth points out that all Mr. Bingley knows is what Mr. Darcy has told him. Thus, somebody has to be lying. But then they go on to talk about Jane and Mr. Bingley, and she likes him a lot. And when he comes over to them, Elizabeth goes over to talk to Charlotte. Mr. Collins comes over and says he hadn't realized that Mr. Darcy was Lady Catherine's nephew, and he feels he ought to pay his respects. Elizabeth discourages him from doing this because approaching a stranger yourself without having someone introduce you would be seen as, quote, an impertinent freedom, particularly since Mr. Darcy outranks Mr. Collins. But he, I love this line, listened to her with the determined air of following his own inclination. And then he pretty much tells her why she's wrong, he thinks, and then goes over to, quote, attack Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth seems embarrassed on his behalf, but watches with no small amount of curiosity. And I think we're seeing through her eyes when we're told that Mr. Darcy's contempt seemed abundantly increasing, but he pretty clearly doesn't just tell Mr. Collins to get lost or anything. She gets seated near her mother at dinner, and her mother goes on and on to Charlotte about Jane marrying Mr. Bingley. Mr. Darcy is across from them, and Elizabeth asks her mother to lower her voice so he won't hear them. Elizabeth is apparently worried that they will somehow offend him, which worries her since he and Mr. Bingley are such bros. And we are told, quote, the expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. After dinner, people start talking about singing, and Mary, quote, after very little entreaty, gets up to sing. Elizabeth tries to prevent her, quote, by many significant looks and silent entreaties, which are just so effective at communicating telepathically. Anyway, Mary does several stanzas and then receives, quote, the thanks of the table, so she starts another song. The author says, Mary's powers were by no means fitted for such a display. Her voice was weak and her manner affected. Meaning what exactly? Like, I don't even know what the problem is. It doesn't say she's off key or off tempo, but Elizabeth is like in agony. No, I'm sorry. It says Elizabeth was in agonies. Apparently they were plural. She's somehow able to send a telepathic message to their father because it didn't work on Mary, and he says stuff, and Elizabeth is, like, still upset? Even though Mary has stopped singing, I don't know. Anyway, everybody wants to know who's going to sing next, and Mr. Collins says he won't, just with lots more words. And Elizabeth apparently thinks her entire family is ridiculous and gauche. Mr. Collins sticks with her all night because he still wants to marry her, and she doesn't want to be around him, but she won't just tell him to shove off. I'm not really happy with Elizabeth now either. Get over yourself, girl. So then, the ball is starting to wind to a close, but somehow Mrs. Bennet manages to make them wait for their carriages. This is almost certainly to allow Jane and Mr. Bingley more time together, which they do spend talking to each other. I have no idea how Mrs. Bennet arranges this, but whatever. As the Bennets are finally leaving, Mrs. Bennet invites Mr. Bingley to come visit them, which he says he will at the, quote, earliest opportunity after his return from London, whither he was obliged to go the next day for a short time. They finally leave, and Mrs. Bennet is convinced that Jane is going to marry Mr. Bingley and Elizabeth is going to marry Mr. Collins. She's happy about the second match, but not as happy. This isn't just because Mr. Collins isn't as rich and important as Mr. Bingley, nor is it simply because Elizabeth doesn't actually want to marry Mr. Collins. No. Apparently, it's primarily because Elizabeth is her least favorite child. No reason given. Chapter 19. So, the next day, Elizabeth gets proposed at. Not even really two. Mr. Collins sees her and her mother and one of the younger girls together and asks Mrs. Bennet if he has permission to speak to Elizabeth alone. Elizabeth attempts, and actually, I was just leaving, but her mother legitimately commands her to stick around and get proposed at. That's always fun. So her mom and Kitty, we are only now told which sister was actually there. Even the author seems to treat Kitty and Lydia so they're completely interchangeable. So they leave, and Mr. Collins starts in. This man, bless his heart, goes on for nearly 2 pages about how he has come to this decision and begins on the subject of what things will be like once they are married. And it is at that point that the author tells us it was absolutely necessary to interrupt him now. So Elizabeth jumps in, and she points out that she has, quote, made no answer, which, of course she hadn't, given that Mr. Collins has not actually asked her any question whatsoever. But she gracefully dodges that issue and says that she is aware of the honor that is being shown to her, but must tell him no. But Mr. Collins weaves this aside and says he's aware that young ladies often refuse a proposal as a way of being coy and playing hard to get, even if it's from somebody they actually want to marry. And he says that therefore, he'll just wait for her to change her mind, and then they'll get married. Elizabeth seems more than a little irked by this dismissal of her statement. Hasn't she yet learned that part of being a woman means that people don't pay attention to what you say? But she changes tactics, saying that, well, Lady Catherine wouldn't approve of her. But Mr. Collins says he doubts that. And he says he'll put in a good word for her with Lady Catherine the next time he sees her. Isn't he just so thoughtful? They go back and forth for another 2 pages, and neither one is willing to relent. It's mildly amusing, though I don't think I find it quite as funny as it is intended to be. I got tired of it pretty quickly. I think we're supposed to sympathize with Elizabeth because she's being completely honest, and her forthrightness is being taken for flirtatiousness. But the thing is, she had a clear, unambiguous rejection that was ignored. And yet, she continued to attempt to give a clear, unambiguous, rational explanation for her rejection. I mean, sweetie, it didn't work the first time. If you want a different result, maybe choose a different strategy. She has been directly described by the narration as someone sensible and clever, but in this chapter she seems particularly thick-headed. Despite offering a logically sound argument, she is being, in her own way, just as unreasonable as Mr. Collins. They are both amazingly stubborn, even if it is in completely different ways. Anyway, she retreats, declaring that if Mr. Collins won't leap off, she will ask for her father's help in getting rid of him. The last line of the chapter is pretty good. The narrator notes that a no from Mr. Bennet could not be mistaken for the affectation and coquetry of an elegant female. Chapter 20. As soon as Elizabeth makes her exit, her mother goes in to congratulate Mr. Collins as she was waiting just out in the next room. The thing is, this implies that she wasn't completely eavesdropping, because then she would have heard the refusal. I don't, however, think that it's supposed to show that she has even that amount of mannerly behavior, but rather that she thought she knew how everything was going to turn out and didn't have any reason to listen in. While she had dawdled about outside the room, it didn't mention any sort of pacing or other sort of nervous behavior. Mr. Collins accepts her congratulations and explains that he's confident that Elizabeth's refusal is due to her, quote, her bashful modesty and the genuine delicacy of her character. Because Mrs. Bennet knows he is not talking about Jane, and that is the only one of her daughters to which such a description could apply. She says she's going to wrangle Elizabeth around. However, at this point, Mr. Collins actually shows a smidgen of sense and says that if Elizabeth really is as, quote, headstrong and foolish as her mother says, then maybe they wouldn't be such a good match. Well, this doesn't make Mrs. Bennet feel better. It's at this point that I noticed that Elizabeth has different nicknames, by the way. Sometimes she's Lizzie, and sometimes Eliza, and sometimes Elizabeth. But she's never Beth, or any of those variants, nor Liza or Liz, although I think Liz is more recent. So it was at this point that I decided to go all the way back through the book previously and see when this happened and who said it, and whether it was based on who said it or on the situation. So her mother continually calls her and refers to her as Lizzie. Her father, both of the times that we have her name, it's in direct address. Once it's Elizabeth, once it's Lizzie. Miss Bingley calls her Miss Eliza directly, calls her Eliza Bennet when she's not present, and when she is present and she's talking about her, she refers to her as Miss Eliza Bennet. Jane always calls her Lizzie. Mr. Bingley was interesting. In chapter 8, he refers to her as Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and in chapter 10, he refers to her as Miss Bennet, which is really interesting because Miss Bennet should be Jane. I don't know if that's just a mistake or what, but I'm really curious about that. Sir William, who is the father of her friend Charlotte, refers to her as Miss Eliza both times in direct address. Darcy refers about her as Miss Elizabeth, and the narrator always refers to her as Elizabeth. So what it sounds like is that she's Lizzie to family. This makes sense because it's kind of a more diminutive, almost babyish sort of name. She's Eliza to those who are not family but who are familiar with her, and she's Elizabeth to those who are formal with her. I found Miss Bingley's phrasing particularly interesting because she uses the title Miss when she's around, but she drops it when she's talking about her behind her back. Additionally, she uses Elizabeth's family name when she's talking about her, but when she's talking to her and at the time she wants something from her, she uses only her given name and does not reference her family name. Anyway, back to the story. Mrs. Bennet goes to ask her husband for assistance and explains what has happened to him. Elizabeth is then called to the library. Her father asks if she has indeed refused Mr. Collins's proposal, and she says that she has. He says that she has a difficult decision to make. Quote, "Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Elizabeth is understandably relieved not to have to go through this completely alone, although her mother will not let go of the matter and pretty much pitches a fit in front of company, as a matter of fact, even though it's Charlotte Lucas, who is practically family, if not quite. As Charlotte was walking in, first Lydia runs up to her and tells her what has happened, and then Kitty does. And then she gets to see Mrs. Bennet in near hysterics until Mr. Collins returns to the room, and Mr. Collins distinctly, if long-windedly, accepts Elizabeth's refusal. Honestly, I don't see why everybody seems to sneer at him so. And by this, I mean readers, not just the people in the book. At this point, he's been rejected, and he's stinging from it. Rejection isn't fun, even when it's not really somebody you care deeply for. But he does accept Elizabeth's rejection, even though he knows and acknowledges that it may upset Mrs. Bennet. I like what he says here at the end of the chapter. "My dear madam," he replied, "let us be forever silent on this point. Far be it from me," he presently continued in a voice that marked his displeasure, "to resent the behavior of your daughter. Resignation to inevitable evils is the duty of us all, the peculiar duty of a young man who has been so fortunate as I have been in early preferment, and I trust I am resigned." Perhaps not the less so from feeling a doubt of my positive happiness had my fair cousin honored me with her hand, for I have often observed that resignation is never so perfect as when the blessing denied begins to lose somewhat of its value in our estimation. You will not, I hope, consider me as showing any disrespect to your family, my dear madam, by thus withdrawing my pretensions to your daughter's favor, without having paid yourself and Mr. Bennet the compliment of requesting you to interpose your authority in my behalf. My conduct may, I fear, be objectionable in having accepted my dismission from your daughter's lips instead of your own, but we are all liable to error. My object has been to secure an amiable companion for myself, with due consideration for the advantage of all your family. And if my manner has been at all reprehensible, I here beg leave to apologize. So, I literally talked about Mr. Collins yesterday with a fellow teacher of mine, a friend of mine. We both teach at the same school, and I like Mr. Collins. He is awkward and self-absorbed, and he goes on and on. But here, this little speech, he essentially apologizes to Mrs. Bennet for not having asked her to push Elizabeth to accept his proposal. I think that shows just a lot of grace on his part. Maybe we're not supposed to read it that way, and maybe that's reading it with 21st century eyes. But the idea that the parents are the guardians of their children, and, especially a daughter, that it's their decision as much as, if not more than hers, seems reasonable given for a contemporary audience. And the fact that he accepts, even if not immediately, because again, he's awkward and doesn't quite get it, he thinks it over, realizes that Elizabeth meant what she said, that she wasn't just being flirty and girlish, and accepts that, and then also realizes that her mother is going to be unhappy about this and does what he can to placate and show respect for her. I like that in him. I like Mr. Collins a lot. I do think he would be a poor match for Elizabeth. Both of them are just so stubborn, and Mr. Collins is aware of his shortcomings and is not comfortable about them. And Elizabeth is not the sort to placate someone or to be gentle with them. She's very direct, and I think I don't think they could be friends, let alone live together. I mean, I guess they could, but they would be pretty miserable. So I'm glad that they're not getting married, but I feel like the narrator is overly hard on Mr. Collins. And I think that's been carried through in what I've seen from the film adaptations as well. Some of what I'm also seeing with Mr. Wickham is influenced by what I know of the rest of the story. But it's interesting to read it from that perspective of that familiarity, noting the importance placed on appearance and reputation. It's really interesting to see how that reads, that how Elizabeth is just, it's more than that she's just glad that Mr. Wickham has friends, that it's important to her that others think well of him. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the rest of this develops. The next video that I do is actually just going to be 3 chapters because I'm pretty sure, chapter 23 is the end. The end of chapter 23 is the end of volume 1. So that will be it until I move on to volume 2. So I'm looking forward to reading the next 3 chapters and doing another video. I would love to hear your comments down in the section below. Have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for watching. Bye!